What family secret shocked you to the core? My uncle got kicked out of my grandparents' house after he got a DUI. After that he got 2 more DUIs and went to jail after he got caught dealing cocaine. My granddad, who was a district attorney, called in a favor and got him off the hook with the understanding that my uncle never contact anyone in my family again. My uncle then got a job driving a coke truck around stocking gas stations and vending machines. Then he got a job working utilities in a small town near my family. After saving his money for 10 years, he asked my mom if he could build us a house. This was the first contact he had with our family in over a decade. He hired his own crew, bought his own materials, the whole 9 yards, free of charge for my parents. The house he built was so nice, other people started asking him to build their houses. Soon he started his own company and now is the owner of the largest residential construction company in 2 large cities. It was shocking for me because growing up, he was always so nice and kind, got along great with everyone, and you would have never guessed what his past was. Maybe 6 months ago or so I found out that I have a maternal half-brother that I never knew about. Found him on Facebook. He is a very decent human being and has been nothing but friendly towards me. His childhood sounds horribly sad at the fault of my mother, and it's for that reason I still can't bring myself to really sit down and talk to him about family history. Grandpa built homes for a living. If money was tight he'd set it on fire so he could be paid to rebuild. I was about 5 when I walked into the basement in the secret room. My father prohibited me from going there for some BS reason, and one day I went by myself. He was growing weed for personal use in the basement. I never told him I found out, and I just carried on. I got pregnant while unmarried, at 22 years old. My mom was worried my grandparents, while very accepting on the surface, might be silently judging the situation, and shared this with her father. He shared with her that back in 1959 he met my gram, and got her pregnant, before they were married. Went off to basic training in another state, promising to come back and marry her. No one thought he would, but he did. She was sent to a home for unwed women, and he found her, married her and had 4 more kids. My mom is the oldest. They kept this a secret from all the kids, although the older generation knew, but were almost all dead by the time he revealed it to her. Kinda romantic. After I was an adult, my uncle, mom's brother, and aunt divorced, and I asked my mom why she thought it happened after like 25 years of marriage, and she nonchalantly, not heartlessly, but just matter of fact, since I was now an adult and apparently it was fine to tell me this shit, told me all about how my aunt was super screwed up because her father used to rape her and her sister when they were children, and how she had been bulimic, used laxatives, and was an alcoholic. Apparently my uncle also was and is a bad alcoholic. He's a jovial one though. She had always seemed very normal, except that she was kind of strict. Always made her son and us cousins remove our shoes in the house, and everyone had to eat any food that was on our plates, and kept her house immaculate. This was strict to me, because our house was always messy, and we almost never finished our plates. A few years ago she put a gun in her mouth, and blew her face off. She survived, but is disfigured. Just saw her this weekend at her granddaughter's birthday party. When my mom first told me all of that, I remember saying, wow, I guess I get to hear all the fucked up stuff I was sheltered from as a kid. Mom, welcome to adulthood. My dad had an affair and a child from that affair that I've never met. My mom told me when I was 21 in case the daughter showed up at some point. My mom's condition for staying with him was that he never saw that woman or that kid again, and he agreed. My aunt cut off communication with my family after my grandparents died. She was their caretaker, and after they died she just disappeared from our lives. About a year or so later, my dad gets a call from Florida PD, saying he needs to come claim/identify her body. From what we gathered from some people she knew, she had cancer. When my dad and sister got down there, they are told she killed herself in a hotel room by drinking antifreeze. She never had cancer. When she stopped talking to my family, she took whatever money she had from my grandparents and traveled the world, and when money ran out, she offed herself. After we figured some of this stuff out, we were in contact with some of her friends who she had made on her trips. They were all, including a nurse, convinced by her that she had cancer. She was just a pathological liar. TL. Dr. Aunt took off with grandparents' money after they died, traveled the world, convinced people she had cancer, then killed herself when the money ran out. When I was a kid, my dad never let me play with toy guns and I never understood why. I remember one day me and my neighbor were playing on the porch with Cap's guns. He had let me have one he had that he didn't want anymore. My dad saw us and came out really angry, took the gun from my hand, broke it on the porch, and told me to go inside. I was both scared and confused, but didn't say a word. Years later, my mom told me a secret about my dad. The reason he didn't like to see me play with guns was because when he was young he was at a party with friends. The guy hosting went upstairs and came back down with a gun and shot himself in the head in front of everyone. Finding that out gave me a completely new perspective on my dad and his actions when I was a kid. My dad's job was an architect. He's retired now. I always thought that he worked in Dunkin' Donuts, since I didn't think he looked like he had much of an education. For context, he's an immigrant from Bangladesh and could barely speak English. Turns out he has multiple architectural degrees and his family is upper middle class. That still doesn't change the fact that he thinks Metal Gear Solid is Harry Potter. My mom was adopted as a child. She knew her whole life that she was adopted, but she knew nothing about her birth family except that her parents had her when they were teenagers and they put her up for adoption because they weren't married. She was born in 1963, for context. But, about 3 years ago, she was contacted by her birth parents. Apparently they stayed together, eventually got married, and had 2 sons. Neither of the sons knew about my mom until about 3 years ago, when my mom's birth parents told them about her. It turned out to be a happy family secret, though. My mom is now very close with her birth parents and her biological brothers, and my extended family on that side were very welcoming. Also, these are just some fun facts. My mom grew up literally 5 minutes away from her biological family. She went to the same schools as her biological brothers, although they never met, as she is 5 years older than them. My mom's ex-husband, my dad, was lab partners with one of her biological brothers in high school, and my mom's adopted brother's wife used to babysit the biological brothers. It's such a small world. It's between me and my dad for the most part, but here goes. My grandmother passed away about 1.5 years ago, and my mother was an absolute wreck, still is, over it. My dad and I were complete realists, and came to the conclusion that grandma wanted to die because she couldn't handle doing all the work around the house with her husband and mentally disabled 50-year-old son at home yelling at each other all the time. It wore her out to the point that she became sick. When dad and I were at the hospital with her, and mom and grandpa left to get a bite to eat, grandma opened her eyes and told me and my dad, "I can't live here anymore. I'm just tired. I want them to let me go." Dad and I swore to never tell anyone that in our family. And we haven't. And we probably never will. She died 2 hours after saying that. My grandmother did not die 10 years ago. She was crazy and locked away in a mental institution on the other side of town for the past 50 years. But now she's dead. One day my parents sat me down and said that my grandmother, father's side, had just died. But as far as the whole family knew, she had died at least 10 years ago. Nope, she was insane. Has been living committed to a mental institution since 1940, but now she's dead. My mom and dad were going to the funeral, be back by supper time. Nothing to see here. I never met her, saw only one photo of her, wedding photo. I knew that my grandfather had been gotten divorced in the 1930s and my dad lived with my aunt, in the same city. There were allegations that my grandfather was abusive and violent, which is why my dad lived with my aunt. And there were rumors that she was not crazy, that she fought back, and he pushed to have her committed because he wanted out of the marriage. The other secret they told me 2 years later, my sister had an unplanned pregnancy in college, has a daughter who is now grown up, and they have reconnected, so they have actually been grandparents since 1975, but never mentioned it, and I had a niece I did not know about who was nearly my age, who also lived in the same city. TLDR, extra family members falling out of the woodwork. My great-grandfather had a lobotomy because of unknown mental issues. He was basically a zombie afterwards and died shortly before my grandmother married my grandfather. Really sad, because I always heard he was a wonderful guy, and it must suck to see that happen. And B, now know why my grandmother never speaks of him. There's also quite a few family members on that side with anxiety disorders, myself and my sister included. They're all very well controlled, and not a hindrance for the most part at all, because of modern medicine and such. That also makes me sad, because I bet it's hereditary, whatever was bothering great-grandpa. He probably just needed better treatment. My aunt isn't the only wife, and she is so nice that she actually allowed her husband to marry another woman. However, unfortunately her husband now uses her for things like food and shelter, but whenever he goes on a holiday he takes the other wife. I then found out that when he wanted to marry the other woman she said that he'd have to divorce her. They then went to court, and the husband says that he will only divorce her if she won't try to take from him properties and all that. She disagreed. The guy then bribed someone off. They go to court, and he suddenly becomes the victim and doesn't want to divorce her, and she had to remain married to the guy and see him marry someone else too. She also has to make pastries and even sometimes takes care of the second wife's kid. I'm so livid about it, but she gave up the fight a long time ago. Nowadays whenever he comes to her house it becomes more of a burden. He expects all his clothes clean and ironed, uses the only car their kids could actually drive. He bought a manual car for himself, and an auto car for my aunt and her kids to use to buy grocery and necessities, expects home cooked meals, and constantly verbally abuses her. Her eldest son won't even have dinner together with them, because he can't stand how his dad is treating his mom. He tries his best to protect my aunt. The only thing that is keeping the fucking guy useful is that he sometimes gives money to his kids for their education, although he is forcing them to learn what he wants them to learn, like how the eldest son was more interested in business, but he forced him to take engineering instead, and he also provides the money for food, but my aunt has to go ask him for it and get verbally abused. While she does so, BTW, she's unfit to work and too freaking nice. She makes pastries and bakes awesome cakes, but if someone asks for it, she do it for free, even though she doesn't even have the money. I'm getting pissed just writing about it. I wouldn't say it's a family secret, but they were keeping it hush hush about it. Apparently the day my mom found out she was pregnant with me, my dad yelled and pressured her to not keep the pregnancy. My mom, my brother, and sister left to live with my grandparents for a while because of that fight. He eventually came around, but still pretty damn shocking to find out that your dad didn't want you initially. Also, I hit a rabbit late at night in the middle of Nevada while on a road trip with my dad. Immediately after hitting it, my dad says, at least it wasn't a person. Found out a few years later that he hit a drunk guy on the highway when he was in college. He was ruled not at fault in court. Needless to say, my dad and I have an odd relationship. Your mother was married before we met, but wait, that's not it. I broke up your mother's marriage and we married shortly afterwards. We were so in love for these past 25 years. Still not it. I was in a committed gay relationship when I met your mother, and then decided to be straight when my boyfriend left me to chase his dreams in Sweden. OMG, this is still not it. I know your mother just died 3 weeks ago, but I moved this guy named Jeff into the house and he will be sleeping with me. Yeah, that was it. New boyfriend sleeping where my mother literally died less than a month ago. Also, don't tell your sisters. Thanks, Dad. My uncle was murdered at the age of 20. He was a very stand-up guy, very sociable, very likable, and extremely kind. He went to a party one day and stayed afterwards to help the hosts, an elderly couple, clean up. A robber came in and shot all 3 of them to death. The guy was quickly caught, but showed no remorse for his actions. After a relatively short trial, he was sentenced and given life plus 1,000 years. He has sworn to finish the job and kill my entire family if he ever gets out. He is up for parole every 5 years or so. It's believed that my aunt and her sister murdered a man. There's no evidence, and the case remains unsolved. My aunt was madly in love with the dude, and he was getting married. He was found dead in his home, beaten to death with a bat. The police believe he knew the killer or killers. There was no sign of forced entry. A family friend said on the night the victim was murdered, he saw two blonde women walking down the road away from the victim's house, in the dark. My aunt and her sister are both blonde. My family ended up having tons of secrets. That really shocked me when I found out, but that are now just whatever. Two of my aunts seemed to be incapable of avoiding pregnancy in their teens. One aunt had 2 abortions for unwanted teen pregnancies before the doctor refused to give her a third, and she was forced to have the baby. She gave the baby up for adoption. Another aunt had 2 unwanted teen pregnancies and went through with both of them. She gave the first baby up for adoption and tried to raise the second baby for about 6 months before realizing she wasn't cut out for it. My grandparents were farm hands and moved around a lot to follow where the work was, so during one of their moves it was just agreed that my grandmother would take the baby on instead, and he was raised as my uncle instead of my cousin. Everyone in the family now knows this and still treats him as an uncle because that's his preference and that's what we grew up with. 2 of my great uncles had marriages to the same woman. During her first marriage to one of my uncles, she started having an affair with his brother and eventually left my first great uncle to run off with the second. They then remained married for the rest of their lives, but my 2 great uncles never spoke again.